May 27, 1541. A 67-year-old woman stands at the execution block. The axe comes down and misses her neck. She screams. The executioner strikes again, and again. 11 times the blade hacks into her frail body before she finally dies. Her crime? Being related to the wrong person. This wasn't some medieval barbarian. This was Henry VIII, and if you think beheading his wives is brutal, you haven't heard what he did to his closest friends. Hit subscribe right now, because the horrors you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Tudor king. This is the cruelty history tried to bury. London, 1509. A 17-year-old prince takes the throne amid celebrations across England. Poets call him the handsomest sovereign in Christendom. Scholars praise his intellect. Musicians marvel at his talent. Henry VIII seems destined to be the perfect Renaissance king, educated, athletic, charming. The future looks golden. Fast forward 30 years. That same king has transformed into something unrecognizable. The palaces of England now pulse with a single emotion: terror. Courtiers whisper in corners, knowing walls have ears. Servants taste the king's food before every meal, praying they won't be the one to drop dead. Friends who laughed together at banquets yesterday won't make eye contact today, terrified that association with the wrong person could mean the scaffold tomorrow. What happened to Henry VIII? The answer is complex, but the result was unmistakable. Somewhere between his golden youth and his final diseased years, paranoia consumed him. He began seeing traitors everywhere, in his closest advisors, in his wives, in the monks who'd once prayed for his soul, even in the woman who'd been his own godmother. His obsessions grew darker with each passing year. He became convinced people were plotting to poison him. When his leg ulcers wouldn't heal, he suspected witchcraft. When his marriages failed, he blamed conspiracies rather than his own choices. And Henry VIII had something most paranoid men do and possess: absolute power to act on every suspicion. The numbers tell a chilling story. During his 36 years on the throne, historians estimate that between 57,000 and 72,000 people were executed. Read that again. Not hundreds, thousands upon thousands. For context, that's more executions than the next 3 Tudor monarchs combined. Some days, multiple scaffolds ran red across London. The executioners couldn't keep up with the demand. But Henry didn't just kill strangers or distant rebels. That's what makes his reign uniquely terrifying. He destroyed the people closest to him. The men who'd served him faithfully for decades found themselves in the Tower, writing desperate letters that went unanswered. Women who'd once been honored at court were dragged to execution grounds. Families that had supported the Tudors for generations were wiped out in a single afternoon. No title could protect you. Cardinal, Duke, Queen, all those crowns and coronets meant nothing when Henry's suspicion fell on you. Being of royal blood made you more dangerous, not more safe. Your decades of loyalty, your noble lineage, your age, your gender, none of it mattered. What's most disturbing is how quickly the falls happened. You could wake up as the king's favorite, dining at his table, receiving gifts and lands. By sunset, you could be locked in the Tower, listening to carpenters build your scaffold outside. The machinery of Tudor justice moved with terrifying speed when Henry wanted someone gone. This wasn't the justice system we know today. No lengthy trials, no appeals, no innocent until proven guilty. If Henry wanted you dead, you were already a ghost. The only question was which method he'd choose for your end. And some of those methods were worse than death itself. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that a single wrong word could end your life. Not an exaggeration, not a metaphor, literal death, often within days. This was reality for anyone within Henry VIII's orbit. The Tudor court wasn't just a place of danger. It was a stage where every gesture was watched, every conversation reported, every friendship potentially fatal. Courtiers developed a sixth sense for reading the king's moods. They learned to laugh at his jokes before he finished them, to agree with opinions he hadn't yet voiced, to disappear from rooms when his temper began to shift. The rules of survival were impossible because they constantly changed. What pleased Henry on Monday might enrage him by Friday. The woman he praised as virtuous in springtime could be called a whore by summer. The adviser he trusted with state secrets could become a traitor overnight, and nobody, including the accused, would understand why. Consider the mechanics of a typical downfall. You'd be summoned to the king's presence, expecting perhaps a new appointment or a grant of lands. Instead, guards would be waiting. No explanation given. Your house would be searched while you were arrested. By the time your family learned what happened, you'd already be locked in the tower. Within a week, a bill of attainder might be rushed through Parliament, declaring you guilty without trial. Your execution date would be set before you'd even been formally charged. Bills of attainder became Henry's favorite weapon. These legislative acts allowed Parliament to convict someone of treason without bothering with evidence, witnesses, or defense. You simply ceased to have rights. Your property was forfeit to the crown. Your family name was tainted. Your children would inherit your disgrace, along with nothing else, since everything you owned now belonged to Henry. The speed of these reversals created a climate of constant anxiety. Lord Rochford attended his sister Anne Boleyn's coronation as honored family. 3 years later, he was beheaded for allegedly committing incest with her, a charge so absurd that even Henry's own courts struggled to justify it. The distance between glory and the grave could be measured in months, sometimes weeks. People learned to build relationships carefully, if at all. Getting too close to anyone marked for destruction meant you'd likely follow them down. When someone fell from favor, their friends would vanish like smoke. Former allies would suddenly recall suspicious conversations that never happened. Servants would testify to treasonous words they'd never heard. Everyone became a potential informant because refusing to provide testimony against the accused could make you suspect too. The court became a hall of mirrors where nothing was as it seemed. Smiles hid terror. Compliments masked desperation. Loyalty was performed, not felt, because genuine loyalty had proven worthless. You could serve Henry faithfully for 30 years, only to discover that 3 decades of devotion bought you nothing when his interests shifted. Some of the most powerful men in England learned this lesson in the cruelest way possible. Men who'd shaped the kingdom, who'd executed others on Henry's orders, who'd believed themselves indispensable. They discovered that in Henry's England, no one was indispensable except the king himself. If anyone should have felt safe, it was Thomas Cromwell. For over a decade, he was the architect of Henry's England. Not born to nobility, his father was a blacksmith, and brewer Cromwell rose through sheer brilliance and ruthless efficiency. He'd served Cardinal Wolsey, survived his master's fall, and somehow convinced Henry that he was invaluable. And for years, he was. Cromwell didn't just advise the king. He transformed the entire kingdom. He engineered Henry's break from Rome, creating the Church of England when the Pope refused to grant an annulment. He masterminded the dissolution of the monasteries, filling Henry's treasury with church wealth. He modernized government administration, creating systems that would outlast both men by centuries. But his most valuable skill? Making Henry's problems disappear. When Henry wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, Cromwell found a way. When Henry tired of Anne 3 years later, Cromwell orchestrated her destruction, manufacturing evidence, gathering testimony, building a treason case from nothing. He'd done the same for others. Sir Thomas More, the saintly scholar who refused to accept Henry's supremacy over the church. The Carthusian monks who wouldn't bend. Countless nobles whose lands Henry coveted. Cromwell knew how to turn suspicion into conviction, how to transform inconvenient people into condemned traitors. Henry rewarded him lavishly. Titles accumulated: Master Secretary, Lord Privy Seal, Earl of Essex, Lord Great Chamberlain. Cromwell held more offices simultaneously than any subject in memory. He lived in luxury, collected art, built grand estates. Foreign ambassadors knew that the route to Henry's favor ran through Cromwell's door. Then came Anne of Cleves. Henry needed a political alliance with German Protestant princes. Cromwell, always eager to strengthen the Protestant cause in England, arranged a marriage. He'd seen only a flattering portrait of Anne. Henry, trusting his chief minister's judgment, agreed to the union. When Anne arrived in January 1540, Henry was horrified. He called her a Flanders Mare, complained she wasn't as described, and made his displeasure brutally clear. But by then, the marriage contract was signed. Henry felt trapped, humiliated, and looking for someone to blame. Cromwell had miscalculated catastrophically. The king's enemies nobles, who resented this blacksmith's son wielding such power, religious conservatives, who hated his Protestant reforms, saw their opening. Within months, Cromwell's world collapsed. On June 10, 1540, guards arrested him during a council meeting. The charges were a patchwork of accusations: treason, heresy, corruption. None of it mattered. Henry wanted him gone. From his cell in the Tower, Cromwell wrote letters that still survive. They're haunting documents. He begged for mercy, reminded Henry of his years of faithful service, pleaded for his life with increasing desperation, called himself your poor prostrate creature and your most humble servant. Henry never responded. Instead, he rushed through a bill of attainder and set an execution date. A man who'd sent so many others to their deaths now faced his own. And Henry, with characteristic cruelty, scheduled it for July 28th, the same day the king would marry his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Cromwell's final gift to his master would be staying out of the way on Henry's wedding day. But Cromwell's own execution was still years away. In the spring of 1535, he was at the peak of his power, and Henry had given him a task that would define the new order: make England's religious houses submit, or make them disappear. The Carthusian monks presented a problem. These weren't corrupt clergy living in luxury. The Charterhouse in London was known for its piety. The monks lived in near total silence, spending their days in prayer and solitude. They owned nothing, harmed no one, and kept largely to themselves. Their reputation for holiness was unmatched, which made their defiance all the more dangerous. Henry's break from Rome required everyone in England to swear an oath, the oath of supremacy, acknowledging him as supreme, head of the Church of England. Most people signed it, whether they believed it or not. Survival demanded it. But the Carthusians couldn't reconcile this oath with their conscience. Their prior, John Houghton, tried to find a compromise. He visited Cromwell personally, hoping for understanding. There would be no understanding. There would be an example. On May 4th, 1535, 3 men were dragged on hurdles through London streets toward Tyburn. John Houghton of the London Charterhouse, Robert Lawrence of Beauvale, Augustine Webster of Axholme, all priors of their houses, all guilty of the same crime, refusing to declare Henry the supreme authority over God's church. The sentence for treason was specific and designed for maximum suffering. Hanging, drawing, and quartering wasn't a quick death. First, you were hanged by the neck, but cut down before death. Still conscious, you'd watch as the executioner opened your body and removed your organs. Only then, finally, would death come. Your body would be hacked into quarters and displayed across the city as a warning. This is what happened to 3 monks whose only crime was staying true to their vows. Witnesses reported that John Houghton, even as his body was opened, forgave his executioners and prayed for the king. His final words were of mercy, not vengeance. Henry wasn't finished with the Carthusians. Over the following months, 15 more monks from the London Charterhouse were arrested. Henry devised a particular cruelty for them. They were chained upright in prison, standing, unable to sit or lie down. They remained like this for 13 days. Several died from the conditions before they could be executed. Those who survived were then put to death. By 1540, the entire Carthusian order in England had been systematically destroyed. 18 monks in total. Their crime wasn't conspiracy or rebellion. They hadn't plotted against Henry or threatened his rule. They'd simply refused to sign a document that violated everything they believed. The message was unmistakable. Henry's authority now extended beyond politics, beyond law, into matters of individual conscience. You couldn't even quietly disagree in your own mind. Silence wasn't protection. Neutrality wasn't an option. You bowed to Henry's will, or you died. And these deaths set a template. Once Henry crossed the line of executing holy men for matters of faith, everyone else became fair game. The bloodiest years were just beginning. If the Carthusian executions demonstrated Henry's ruthlessness toward matters of faith, what happened 3 years earlier revealed something even darker: his willingness to invent new forms of death when existing ones didn't satisfy him. April 15th, 1532. Smithfield. A crowd gathered around an enormous cauldron of water, already heated to boiling. Chained nearby stood a man named Richard Roos, a cook who worked for the Bishop of Rochester's household. In a few minutes, he would experience a death that England hadn't seen in centuries one, specifically revived just for him. The charge was poisoning. In February of that year, Bishop John Fisher had hosted a dinner. 17 people ate the porridge prepared by Roos. 17 people became violently ill. 2 died. The bishop himself only survived because he'd been fasting that day and hadn't touched the food. Suspicion immediately fell on Roos, who claimed he'd only added what he thought were harmless ingredients to the potsum, claimed he said it was a joke, a prank gone catastrophically wrong. Others said he confessed to nothing. The truth became irrelevant quickly. What mattered was Henry's reaction. The king had long harbored an obsessive fear of being poisoned. He employed food tasters. He kept antidotes close. He studied medicine partly to understand poisons better. The idea that someone could kill with something as simple as dinner terrified him more than swords or plots. So Henry did something unprecedented. He went to Parliament and demanded a new law. Not just any law or statute that declared poisoning to be high treason, punishable by a specific method: boiling to death. And here's the truly disturbing part. The law was made retroactive. Richard Roos's alleged crime had occurred in February. Parliament passed the boiling statute in March. Roos would be executed in April under a law that hadn't existed when he supposedly committed his crime. The execution method was as horrific as it sounds, but it wasn't instant. An iron cage was constructed. Roos was placed inside it, and the cage was lowered into the boiling water, then raised, then lowered again. 3 times. Each immersion lasting long enough to cause unimaginable agony, but not immediate death. Witnesses later reported that the crowds, normally entertained by public executions, reacted differently to this one. People fainted. Some were carried away in distress. Even by Tudor standards, where public suffering was routine entertainment, this crossed a line. The spectacle achieved Henry's goal. No one would dare poison anyone in England again. At least not obviously. But here's where the story gets stranger. Some historians have suggested that Henry himself might have orchestrated the poisoning plot. Bishop Fisher was no friend to the king's marriage plans. He actively opposed Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon. Eliminating Fisher would have been convenient, and blaming a lowly cook even more so. We'll never know the truth. What we do know is that one man died in unthinkable torment. The law was twisted to justify it, and Henry's paranoia now had a new outlet. The methods were evolving, and the king was just getting started. Henry's fears weren't limited to poison in his food. By 1546, near the end of his life, he'd become equally obsessed with religious enemies hiding within his own court. And this paranoia would lead to something unprecedented, the torture of a woman in a way that English law explicitly forbade. Anne Askew was 25 years old, educated, articulate, and dangerously outspoken about her Protestant beliefs. In Henry's final years, religious policy had swung back toward conservative Catholicism. Simply owning an English Bible could raise suspicion. Discussing Scripture as a woman was worse. Anne did both, openly. But that's not why she ended up in the Tower. Henry's counselors suspected she had connections to Queen Catherine Parr, his sixth wife, who was known to hold Protestant sympathies. If they could force Anne to implicate the Queen, they could destroy Catherine and everyone in her circle. Anne became a pawn in a deadly court faction battle. After her arrest, interrogators questioned her repeatedly. She gave them nothing. No names, no confessions. No matter how they pressed, she refused to betray anyone. Her examiners grew frustrated. Standard imprisonment wasn't breaking her will, so they decided to break her body instead. The rack was kept in the basement of the Tower's White Tower. It was a simple device with devastating effectiveness, a wooden frame with rollers at each end. The prisoner's wrists were chained to one roller, ankles to the other. Then the rollers were slowly turned in opposite directions, stretching the body until joints dislocated and ligaments tore. English law prohibited racking women. It was considered too barbaric, too dishonorable. But Henry's Lord Chancellor, Thomas Wriothesley, and his associate Richard Rich decided the law didn't apply when they needed answers. They received authorization likely from Henry himself to proceed. On June 29, 1546, Wriothesley and Rich didn't just order the torture. They operated the rack personally. When the Tower's lieutenant, Sir Anthony Kingston, refused to continue turning the mechanism, the two council members took over themselves. They kept turning, kept stretching, demanding names while Anne's joints separated. She never gave them what they wanted. Not a single name. Not Catherine Parr's. Not any of the women in the Queen's household. Nothing. The torture left her unable to walk or even stand. Her body was so damaged that when her execution date arrived 2 weeks later, she couldn't make it to the stake on her own feet. Guards had to carry her to Smithfield in a chair. Even sitting, she could barely hold herself upright. On July 16, 1546, Anne Askew was burned at the stake for heresy. 3 men died with her that day, but history remembers her differently. Not because her death was crueler than theirs, but because of what came before it. She'd endured something no other woman in the Tower's history had faced, and she'd emerged unbroken. Henry died 7 months later. Wriothesley and Rich both survived him, their careers intact, their actions never punished. The machinery of Tudor cruelty didn't require monsters. It just required ambitious men willing to ignore their own laws. While Anne Askew faced torture to extract information, others received no interrogation at all, no questions, no chance to implicate anyone or bargain for mercy. Some were simply erased, and their executions carried out with a cruelty that seemed almost casual. July 28, 1540, dawned as a day of celebration across London. The king was getting married, his 5th wedding. Catherine Howard, young and vivacious, would soon be queen. Musicians prepared. Flowers were arranged. The court buzzed with festive energy. At Tower Hill, a different kind of preparation was underway. Thomas Cromwell had spent 6 weeks in the Tower since his arrest. His desperate letters to Henry had gone unanswered. His plea for a proper trial had been ignored. Parliament had passed the Bill of Attainder, condemning him without ever hearing his defense. The date chosen for his execution seemed deliberately pointed. The same morning, Henry would marry Catherine Howard, the niece of Cromwell's political enemies. One last humiliation for the man who'd once controlled England. When Cromwell arrived at the scaffold, witnesses noted his composure. Unlike many condemned men who ranted about injustice or proclaimed innocence, he gave a conventional speech. He asked forgiveness for his offenses, prayed for the king, and accepted his fate. Perhaps he understood that any other response would be pointless. Then he knelt and saw the executioner for the first time. The man was described in contemporary accounts as ragged and butcherly, not the skilled professional normally assigned to high-ranking executions. Some historians believe this was deliberate, another small cruelty. Others think the regular executioner was unavailable. Either way, the result was the same. The first blow struck Cromwell's neck, but didn't sever it. He would have felt everything: the impact, the tearing, the incomplete cut. The second blow was equally ineffective. Only the third blow finally separated his head from his body. 3 strikes. For a man who'd modernized English government, who'd built Henry's power to unprecedented heights, who'd served faithfully until the moment his service became inconvenient. His death was messy, painful, and conducted with all the efficiency of a butcher shop. Cromwell's head was taken to London Bridge, stuck on a pike, and displayed alongside common criminals. His body was buried without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, within the Tower grounds. He rests there still, in the same chapel as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, all victims of the king they'd served. The timing of his execution, while Henry married Catherine Howard, wasn't coincidental. The Howards had engineered Cromwell's fall. They'd pushed Henry toward the Anne of Cleves marriage disaster, then blamed Cromwell for it. Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had been Cromwell's fiercest rival. Now, as Norfolk's niece became queen, Cromwell died. Henry enjoyed his wedding day. There is no record that he gave any thought to the man who'd spent a decade shaping his reign. The celebration continued. Music played. Vows were exchanged. Meanwhile, at Tower Hill, workers washed blood from the scaffold, preparing it for the next person who would kneel there. Because there was always a next person, the machinery never stopped running. And as Henry's reign continued, the executions would grow more frequent, the victims more shocking. Even family wouldn't be spared. 4 years before Cromwell's fall, another execution revealed just how far Henry's cruelty could extend, not through exotic torture methods or legal innovations, but through betrayal of friendship and calculated psychological terror. Henry Norris wasn't just a courtier. He held the position of groom of the stool, which sounds trivial, but was among the most intimate and trusted roles in the kingdom. He managed the king's private chambers, controlled access to Henry, and handled sensitive personal matters. The position required absolute discretion and complete trust. Norris had served Henry personally for years. They hunted together, joked together, confided in each other. In April 1536, that friendship meant nothing. When Henry decided Anne Boleyn had to go, he needed more than just a failed queen. He needed a scandal so shocking that England would accept her execution. So a case was constructed. Anne had committed adultery with multiple men at court, including her own brother. The accused were rounded up quickly: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, a musician, and George Bullen, Anne's brother. Norris was offered a way out. If he confessed to adultery with the queen, his life would be spared. It was a lie. Of course, there was no evidence, because nothing had happened, but confessing would have been the smart survival move. Many men in his position would have taken it. Norris refused. He wouldn't slander the queen, even to save himself. He maintained his innocence, and Anne's, throughout his imprisonment. The trial was a formality. All 5 men were convicted on May 12, 1536. Their execution was scheduled for May 17th, just 5 days later. Due process moved at whatever speed Henry required. But here's where the cruelty became unbearable. Anne Boleyn was imprisoned in the Tower at the same time. From her window, she could see the scaffold being prepared. On the morning of May 17th, She was forced to witness the execution of all 5 men accused of being her lovers, her brother. Men she'd known, some she'd considered friends, all dying because of charges connected to her. The executions themselves were carried out efficiently. No botched beheadings this time, no prolonged suffering. Just 5 men, one after another, ending their lives on Tower Hill while Anne watched from her window. Henry Norris died maintaining Anne's innocence and his own. His loyalty to the truth cost him everything: his life, his property, his family's future. Years later, Queen Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, would restore the Norris family's fortunes. She clearly believed her mother had been innocent, and that Norris had died defending a queen who'd been wrongfully accused. The speed of it all was almost more disturbing than the violence. From arrest to execution in less than a month. 5 lives ended. A queen destroyed. All built on fabricated evidence that wouldn't have convinced anyone who wasn't terrified to question it. Anne Boleyn herself would follow them to the scaffold 2 days later, on May 19th. Unlike the men, she received a small mercy. An expert swordsman brought from France, ensuring a quick, clean death. It was one of the few mercies Henry ever showed anyone he'd decided to destroy. The 1536 purge had proven something important. Henry would destroy anyone, even friends. But there remained one category of people he'd been cautious about touching: those with royal blood running through their veins. The Plantagenet bloodline, the family that had ruled England before the Tudors, still had living descendants. Killing them would be dangerous. Their very existence represented an alternative claim to the throne. Margaret Pole was one of these dangerous survivors. Born Margaret Plantagenet, she was the niece of 2 kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Her brother, Edward, Earl of Warwick, had been executed by Henry VII to eliminate rival claims to the crown. Margaret had been spared, but stripped of her titles and lands, living in near poverty. When young Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, he'd made a show of righting his father's wrongs. He restored Margaret's title as Countess of Salisbury, returned her estates, and brought her into royal favor. More than that, he trusted her with what mattered most. Margaret became governess to Princess Mary, Henry's daughter, with Catherine of Aragon. She served as Mary's godmother, protector, and maternal figure during crucial years. The bond between them was genuine and deep. Margaret wasn't just a servant, she was family. For decades, this arrangement worked perfectly. Margaret was loyal, competent, and posed no threat. She had sons, including Reginald Pole, who seemed destined for distinguished careers in the church and state. The Pole family had been successfully absorbed into the Tudor establishment. Then Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon began to unravel. When Henry sought his annulment, when he broke from Rome, when he declared himself supreme head of the church, Margaret faced an impossible position. Her beloved Princess Mary was declared a bastard. Catherine of Aragon, whom Margaret had served and respected, was cast aside. And Margaret's own son, Reginald Pole, now a cardinal in Rome, wrote a devastating treatise condemning Henry's actions. Reginald's book didn't just criticize it, eviscerate it. He called Henry a heretic, a tyrant, a disgrace to Christianity. He urged Catholic powers to invade England and remove Henry from the throne. The Pope loved it. Henry was apoplectic, but Reginald was safely in Europe, beyond Henry's reach. His mother was not. Margaret was 65 years old when the persecution began. Old enough to remember when the Tudors were upstarts, when her family had ruled England. Now she watched as Henry's agents searched her homes, looking for anything that could be called treasonous. They found a tunic embroidered with religious symbols, the 5 wounds of Christ. They called it evidence of loyalty to the Catholic rebellion in the north. It was absurd. A piece of clothing is proof of treason. But Henry had learned he didn't need real evidence. He needed an enemy, and Margaret Pole, last of the Plantagenets, mother of his greatest critic, symbol of the old royal bloodline, would serve perfectly. In May 1539, at an age when most people were preparing for a peaceful death, Margaret Pole was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. No formal charges, no trial, just imprisonment while Henry decided what to do with her. She would wait there for 2 years, growing older and frailer, while the king made up his mind. When he finally did, the result would shock even Tudor England. 2 years in the Tower changes a person. Margaret Pole entered at 65. By May 1541, she was 67, frail, elderly, her health declining in the cold, damp conditions. She'd received no trial, no chance to defend herself. The bill of attainder that condemned her was based on her son's actions, not her own. On the morning of May 27th, guards came to her cell with unexpected news. Today was the day. No warning. No time to prepare. Just sudden, brutal finality. What happened next exists in 2 versions, both recorded by witnesses, but contradicting each other. The truth may lie somewhere between them, or perhaps both contain elements of what occurred. Either way, the result was the same. The first account claims Margaret refused to cooperate with her own death. When brought to the block, she declared she wouldn't lay her head down willingly. So should traitors do, and I am none, she reportedly said. Whether from defiance or terror, she had to be forced into position. The second version offers a different explanation for the horror that followed. The regular executioner of London, the skilled professional who'd cleanly beheaded Anne Boleyn and countless others, was away in the north, dealing with rebels. Someone had to substitute. The man they found was young, inexperienced, possibly grabbed from wherever they could find a volunteer willing to do the job. Beheading requires precision. The executioner must strike at exactly the right angle, with the right force, at the vulnerable point where the neck meets the skull. An expert can do it in one clean blow. An amateur cannot. The first strike missed her neck entirely, hitting her shoulder. Margaret, still conscious, still aware, would have felt everything. The second blow was no better. The young executioner, now panicking, kept striking. Some blows hit her head, others her shoulders and back, each one failing to end her suffering. Witnesses counted 11 strikes before Margaret Pole finally died. The execution took place within the Tower walls, not at the public scaffold on Tower Hill. Only a small group witnessed it. But word spread quickly through London, and the reaction wasn't celebration or satisfaction. It was horror. Even people accustomed to public executions, who'd watched criminals hang and traitors be drawn and quartered, found this disturbing. An elderly woman of royal blood, who'd served the Tudor family faithfully for decades, hacked to death by an incompetent executioner over what felt like an eternity. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even efficient tyranny. It was butchery. Some historians argue the botched execution was accidental truly, just the result of an inexperienced substitute. Others suggest it may have been deliberate, a final cruelty ordered by a king who wanted Margaret Pole's death to serve as a particularly memorable warning. We'll never know Henry's intent. What we know is that Margaret Pole, last Plantagenet princess, godmother to a future queen, died in a manner so brutal that it shocked a kingdom already numb to violence. And Henry? He showed no remorse, no regret. He'd eliminated another threat, another link to the old royal bloodline. The method didn't matter. The message was delivered. In Henry's England, not even age, gender, nobility, or decades of service could protect you. Nothing could. Margaret Pole's execution was physically brutal, but Henry's cruelty wasn't always about the method of death. Sometimes it was about what happened before, the mental torment inflicted in the days and hours leading up to the scaffold. Anne Boleyn experienced this in ways that reveal Henry's capacity for psychological warfare. When Anne was arrested on May 2, 1536, she was taken to the Tower of London by river, the same route she traveled just 3 years earlier for her coronation, when she'd arrived in triumph. Now she entered as a prisoner. The symbolism was deliberate. Same buildings, same chambers, entirely different circumstances. She was held in the same royal apartments where she'd stayed before becoming queen. The rooms where she'd prepared for her coronation, where she'd felt joy and anticipation, now served as her cell. Every corner held memories of better days. This wasn't coincidence. Henry could have imprisoned her anywhere in the tower. He chose the location that would maximize her psychological suffering. Then came the executions of May 17th. 5 men killed in quick succession. Anne knew they were dying because of accusations connected to her. Whether she watched from her window or simply heard the crowds and knew what was happening, the effect was devastating. The guilt, deserved or not, would have been crushing. Her brother George died that day. Whatever their relationship had been, and the incest charges were almost certainly fabricated watching family die because of conspiracy theories, involving you would break most people. Anne's mental state deteriorated rapidly. The reports from her jailers describe erratic behavior, wild mood swings between hope and despair, frantic questions about when she would die. Henry granted her one mercy. She wouldn't be burned at the stake, the standard punishment for queens convicted of treason. Instead, she'd be beheaded. But even this kindness came with cruelty. She had to wait. The expert swordsman had to be summoned from France. Days passed. The waiting, the not knowing exactly when, was its own form of torture. When Anne finally died on May 19th, the execution itself was swift and professional. But what happened after revealed Henry's desire to erase her completely. No coffin had been prepared for a Queen of England. Anne Boleyn's body was placed in an old arrow chest, a wooden box meant for storing weapons. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, without ceremony, without a marker, just another body in the tower's mass grave. Henry moved on within days. 11 days after Anne's death, he married Jane Seymour. He had Parliament annul his marriage to Anne retroactively, making their daughter Elizabeth a bastard and erasing the validity of the relationship that had caused so much upheaval. He forbade anyone from speaking Anne's name at court. Her portraits were destroyed or painted over. Her badges and symbols were removed from royal buildings. It wasn't enough to kill her. Henry tried to erase the fact that she'd ever existed. This pattern of psychological cruelty, the symbolic locations, the forced witnessing of others' deaths, the waiting, the erasure, represented a different kind of punishment. One that hurt before death and tried to continue hurting even after. And Anne wasn't the only one to experience Henry's desire to destroy not just bodies, but legacies. The psychological warfare Henry waged wasn't limited to his own wives or political enemies. There was another layer of cruelty that rarely makes it into history books, one that operated in whispers and created an atmosphere of constant dread among the families of courtiers. Women at Henry's court faced an impossible calculus. If the king showed interest in you, refusing could destroy your family. Your husband's career would evaporate. Your father's lands could be seized. Your brothers might find themselves facing trumped-up charges. The king's desire was, in effect, a command. But accepting the king's attention carried its own dangers. Once Henry tired of you, the consequences could be fatal. And if you were married to one of his ministers, the situation became even more complex. Your husband couldn't object without risking treason. He had to pretend not to notice, or worse, facilitate the relationship. The humiliation was deliberate. Some historians have documented cases where women connected to Henry as court wives, of men who served him ended up executed on charges that seemed to materialize from nowhere. The timing was often suspicious. A minister would fall from favor. Shortly after, accusations would surface about his wife's conduct: adultery, conspiracy, treason. The specific charges varied, but the pattern was recognizable. The most insidious aspect was that no one could ever be certain what had actually happened. Had these women genuinely committed crimes? Had they been innocent victims of political machinations? Or had they been caught in the impossible position of rejecting or accepting royal attention, with both choices leading to destruction? The uncertainty itself was a weapon. It kept everyone off balance. If you were a woman at court, you had to navigate an invisible maze where the rules changed without warning. Be too friendly to the king, and you risked accusations of impropriety. Be too cold, and you might offend him. Marry a powerful man, and you became a potential target in court faction battles. The men weren't much better off. Courtiers watched their wives around Henry with barely concealed anxiety. They couldn't protect them without insulting the king. They couldn't ignore suspicious situations without appearing complicit. Some resolved this by keeping their families away from court entirely, sacrificing their own advancement to keep their loved ones safe. This atmosphere transformed the Tudor court into something beyond a political arena. It became a psychological prison where family bonds, marital loyalty, and personal autonomy all dissolved in the face of royal power. You didn't just serve Henry VIII, you surrendered your agency entirely. Your wife wasn't really yours. Your children existed at his pleasure. Your property, your titles, your very life were all provisional, subject to revocation at any moment. The cruelty wasn't always loud in public like Margaret Pole's execution or Anne Boleyn's trial. Sometimes it was quiet, operating through insinuation and fear. But the effect was just as devastating. It destroyed families from within, turning relationships into potential liabilities and love into a dangerous vulnerability. By the end of Henry's reign, the court had become a place where trust was impossible and survival required constant vigilance. The question wasn't whether you'd done anything wrong. The question was whether Henry believed you had, or found it convenient to claim you had. And in that environment, innocence was no protection at all. For centuries, the story of Henry VIII has been told in a particular way. 6 wives, religious reformation, the break from Rome, a larger-than-life monarch who changed England forever. School textbooks dedicate pages to his marriages and maybe mention Thomas More. Documentaries focus on palace intrigue and romantic drama. What they rarely discuss is the industrial scale of the killing. This sanitization didn't happen by accident. It began during Henry's own lifetime, with propaganda that framed his actions as necessary for England's security. Rebels were traitors. Religious dissenters were threats to stability. Executed nobles had plotted against the crown. The official narrative always justified the bloodshed. After Henry's death, his daughter Elizabeth had reasons to soften her father's image. She ruled a divided country that needed stability, not reminders of recent horrors. Better to remember Henry as the strong king who made England independent from Rome than as the tyrant who filled mass graves. The myth-building continued through successive generations, each adding layers that obscured the raw brutality underneath. By the Victorian era, Henry had become almost a caricature, the jolly, rotund king with his many wives. A figure of morbid fascination, yes, but also somehow entertaining. The horrible histories version of Tudor England, where the violence becomes almost cartoonish, easier to digest than the reality. But the numbers tell a different story. Those 18 Carthusian monks who died between 1535 and 1540 weren't just statistics. They were individuals who chose faith over survival. The first group was publicly butchered at Tyburn in front of crowds. Their bodies were quartered and displayed across London as warnings. The later group was chained upright in prison, unable to sit or lie down, left in their own waste until they died from the conditions or were finally dragged out for execution. These weren't battlefield casualties or criminals caught in violence. These were deliberate, state-sanctioned killings of people whose only crime was refusing to sign a document. Yet most histories barely mention them. They appear as footnotes, if at all, while Henry's romantic entanglements get chapter after chapter. The dissolution of the monasteries received similar treatment. History books frame it as administrative reform Henry, closing inefficient religious houses and redistributing church wealth. What gets glossed over is the resistance and what happened to those who resisted. Entire monastic communities were destroyed. Abbots who refused to surrender their houses were tried for treason and executed. Monks were turned out with nothing, left to beg or starve. Estimates suggest thousands died, but exact numbers are impossible to verify because the records were deliberately incomplete. This pattern of historical amnesia extends beyond religious victims. The common people executed under Henry's rain farmers, accused of spreading rumors, servants caught in their masters' downfalls, women burned for heresy, men hanged for minor theft under increasingly harsh laws. They vanish almost entirely from popular history. We remember Anne Boleyn because she was a queen. We forget the thousands who died in obscurity, whose names were never recorded, whose families were too terrified or powerless to preserve their memory. History didn't just soften Henry's cruelty. It erased most of it entirely, leaving behind a narrative that's more palatable, but far less truthful. The question is, why does this sanitization persist even now, when we have access to the records? The Tower of London still stands today, a tourist attraction where visitors take photos and tour medieval rooms. Guides tell sanitized stories. Children buy souvenirs. It's been transformed into heritage entertainment. But if you know where to look, the evidence of what really happened there remains. The tower wasn't just a prison. It was a complex system designed to break people before they died. The famous prisoners held in comfortable chambers were the minority. Most experienced conditions designed to destroy them physically and mentally before their execution date arrived. The basement levels contained the machinery of suffering. Beyond the rack that tortured Anne Askew, there was the scavenger's daughter, an iron frame that compressed the body into a kneeling position. With a rack stretched, this device crushed. Prisoners were folded until their chest cavity compressed, blood vessels burst, and breathing became nearly impossible. Some victims coughed up blood after just minutes in the device. Wall manacles offered another variation of agony. Prisoners were chained with their wrists above their heads, forced to stand or hang. Hours became days. Shoulders dislocated. Circulation stopped in the arms. Sleep was impossible. The body slowly failed while the mind remained conscious to experience every moment. These weren't relics from medieval times. Henry VIII used them actively. His government officials personally operated them, as Wriothesley and Rich demonstrated. The Tower Lieutenant kept detailed records of interrogations and torture sessions. Some of those documents survive, clinical descriptions of systematic cruelty. Tower Hill, just outside the walls, served as the primary execution ground for noble prisoners. Over 125 people died there during Henry's reign alone. The site was chosen deliberately public, enough to send a message, but separate from the common criminals hanged at Tyburn. Nobility deserved the dignity of beheading rather than hanging, but they'd still die where crowds could watch. The bodies didn't travel far. Just inside the tower grounds sits the Chapel Royal of St. Peter at Vincula, a small, beautiful church that serves as the final resting place for many of Henry's victims. The chapel floor is essentially a mass grave. Anne Boleyn lies there, buried in that arrow chest. Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, executed in 1542, rests nearby. Thomas Cromwell's remains are somewhere beneath the stones. Margaret Pole, George Boleyn, Thomas More, dozens of others. During Victorian renovations, workers discovered the burial arrangements were chaotic. Bodies had been interred without coffins, without markers, sometimes without even separating individuals properly. The remains were jumbled together, mixed, impossible to identify with certainty. Queens buried alongside commoners. Advisors next to the monks they persecuted. All equal in death, all forgotten beneath the chapel floor. For centuries, people walked over these graves without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Church services continued in the chapel. The Tower garrison used it for worship. The dead remained silent under the flagstones. Today, visitors can tour the chapel. A plaque identifies some of the notable burials, but the full count of who lies there remains unknown. Not every execution was recorded. Not every body was documented. Some people simply vanished into the tower and were never seen again, their final resting place lost to history. The Tower of London transformed from active prison to museum, but it never stopped being a tomb. The stones remember what the history books forgot. The tower's dead represent only a fraction of Henry's victims. They were the high-profile executions, the ones recorded because the condemned were noble or noteworthy. But across England, the killing extended far beyond London's walls. Modern historians have attempted to calculate the true death toll of Henry's reign. The numbers are staggering and deeply contested. Conservative estimates suggest 57,000 executions. Others push that figure to 72,000 or higher. During a 36-year reign, that averages out to between 4 and 5 people executed every single day. Let that sink in. Every morning of Henry's rule, somewhere in England, multiple people faced death at the state's hands. These weren't all political prisoners or religious martyrs. The vast majority were ordinary people caught in an increasingly brutal legal system. Henry expanded the definition of treason repeatedly, making more and more offenses punishable by death. Speaking against the king's marriage became treason. Refusing the oath of supremacy became treason. Even prophesying the king's death, just saying you thought he might die soon, could get you executed. The theft laws grew particularly savage. Steal anything worth more than a shilling, and you faced hanging. Repeat offenders faced death even for minor crimes. The gallows at Tyburn ran constantly, processing a steady stream of the poor, the desperate, and the unlucky. Women faced their own specific dangers. Burning at the stake remained the punishment for women convicted of treason or heresy. The logic was that beheading required exposing the woman's neck, which was considered immodest. Better to burn her alive than risk impropriety. The absurd cruelty of this reasoning tells you everything about Tudor priorities. The religious upheaval added thousands more to the count. When Henry dissolved the monasteries, resistance was met with overwhelming force. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a northern uprising protesting the changes, resulted in mass executions. Leaders were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Participants were hunted down across multiple counties. Entire villages that supported the rebellion faced collective punishment. The exact number of dead remains unknown because Henry's forces didn't bother keeping careful records in the aftermath. Bills of attainder became Henry's preferred method for dealing with inconvenient nobles. These parliamentary acts declared someone guilty without trial, without evidence, without any pretense of justice. Your property was seized immediately. Your execution was scheduled before you even knew the charges. The process moved faster than any defense could be mounted. What makes Henry's reign unique isn't just the numbers, but the efficiency. He created a machinery of state death that operated smoothly and without significant opposition. Parliament rubber-stamped his attainders. Courts convicted based on flimsy evidence or none at all. Executioners worked overtime. The entire system was designed to kill quickly and move on to the next case. Compare this to other Tudor monarchs. Mary I, remembered as Bloody Mary, executed around 300 Protestants during her 5-year reign. Terrible, yes, but a fraction of her father's toll. Elizabeth I was more restrained still, though she had her own victims. Henry stands alone in the scale and systematic nature of his violence. The body count wasn't an unfortunate side effect of his policies. It was the policy. Terror as governance. Death as deterrent. Killing on a scale that kept the entire kingdom paralyzed with fear. which raises the final, most disturbing question. How did he get away with it? The answer lies in understanding absolute monarchy, not as a historical curiosity, but as a system specifically designed to prevent accountability. Henry VIII didn't rule alone, yet no institution could check his power. Parliament existed, but it served at his pleasure. He could dissolve it whenever convenient, and summon it only when needed to legitimize his decisions. The bills of attainder that condemned his victims without trial? Parliament voted for those. Not because members believed the accused were guilty, but because opposing the king's will was suicidal. Every vote was cast under an unspoken threat. Agree or become the next target. The nobility couldn't unite against him. Henry understood that collective resistance was his only real danger, so he ensured it never materialized. He played factions against each other: conservatives versus reformers, old families versus new men. When one group gained too much influence, he'd elevate their rivals. Thomas Cromwell's enemies celebrated his fall, not realizing they'd simply cleared the way for the next person to accumulate dangerous amounts of power. And that person would eventually fall too. The cycle kept everyone competing for survival, rather than organizing opposition. The Church, traditionally a counterbalance to royal power, had been neutralized. By declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, Henry eliminated the one institution that could claim authority beyond earthly kings. There was no longer any appeal to Rome, no religious law that superseded his commands. Spiritual authority and temporal power merged in one person who answered to no one. Propaganda did the rest. Henry controlled the narrative completely. Royal proclamations framed every execution as necessary for England's security. Traitors threatened the realm. Heretics endangered souls. Rebels risked civil war. The official story always cast Henry as the defender, never the aggressor. Without independent media or widespread literacy, most people only heard the government's version of events. The religious turmoil provided perfect cover. England was genuinely divided between Catholics and Protestants. Both sides feared the other gaining control. Henry exploited this brilliantly, positioning himself as the moderate center while executing extremists from both camps. Each side stayed quiet when the other suffered, hoping their own cooperation would buy safety. By the time they realized no one was safe, resistance had become impossible. Perhaps most importantly, Henry ruled during a transition period when medieval notions of kingship still held power. The king was God's appointed representative on earth. Opposing him wasn't just treason, it was sin. This belief ran deep in Tudor society, creating psychological barriers to resistance that were almost insurmountable. When Henry died in January 1547, he left behind a kingdom transformed by fear. The mechanisms he built, the expanded treason laws, the bills of attainder, the culture of informants and suspicion survived him. His children inherited not just the throne, but the machinery of absolute power. The bones still lie beneath the Tower's chapel. The records still detail the executions. But the complete truth remains buried, deliberately obscured by centuries of myth-making that preferred a larger-than-life king to a systematic killer. History didn't just soften Henry VIII's cruelty. It made him legendary. And perhaps that's the most disturbing legacy of all, that we remember the monster as something almost admirable, while his victims remain forgotten beneath the stones.